Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Charlotte's Waltz. Vienna in the heart of winter was a city of exquisite contradictions. Outside, the Ringstrasse lay entombed in a pristine shroud of white, the air so cold it felt like breathing powdered glass. Inside the Palais Kinsky, however, 1,000 beeswax candles waged a successful war against the encroaching night, their collective heat creating a stuffy golden miasma that clung to the velvet draperies and gilded cornices. It was a world suffocating on its own opulence, thick with the intermingled scents of hothouse flowers, expensive French perfume, and the faint, damp smell of melting snow carried in on the hems of ball gowns. The air hummed with a constant, oppressive drone, the brittle laughter of countesses, the pompous pronouncements of military officers, and the clinking of crystal, all layered over the polite, uninspired strains of a chamber orchestra. Seated at the grand piano, Anton Heller felt less like an artist and more like a piece of ornate furniture, placed there for the aesthetic pleasure of the assembled aristocracy. His fingers, long and nimble, moved over the ivory keys with a precision that had become rote, a mechanical act devoid of the soul he had once poured into his music. He was playing a selection of popular nocturnes, pieces so safe and predictable they were merely an extension of the polite chatter. His expression was one of weary detachment, his gaze drifting over the sea of powdered faces and glittering jewels. He saw not patrons of the arts but vultures in silk, their lives as carefully composed and ultimately empty as the music he was forced to play. He was a captive, his art a commodity, and a bitter resentment curdled in his gut. During a mercifully brief interlude, while the guests migrated towards the champagne fountains, Anton escaped the grand ballroom. He pushed through a heavy damask curtain into a small, blessedly quiet alcove that overlooked a frozen garden. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window pane, the silence a balm on his frayed nerves. It was then, through the thick walls and the lingering hum of the gala, that he heard it. It was not the sound of the orchestra restarting. This was something else entirely. A single piano somewhere in an adjoining salon began to play. The melody cut through the muffled din of the party like a shard of glass, at once melancholic and fiercely intelligent. It was a waltz, but not one he had ever heard. It moved with a strange limping grace, a 3/4 time signature that seemed to carry the weight of a profound sorrow. Yet within its intricate harmonies lay a current of defiant passion. It was complex, breathtakingly original, and utterly honest. Anton straightened, his weariness vanishing, replaced by an urgent, almost primal curiosity. This music was not decorative, it was not polite, it was alive. Drawn by the sound as if by an invisible thread, he moved silently through a series of connecting rooms, following the melody as it grew clearer, more articulate. He found its source in a small, dimly lit salon, dominated by a Pleyel piano. A young woman sat with her back to him, her shoulders slightly hunched, her body lost in the act of creation. Her fingers moved with a fluid, unconscious grace, not performing but communing with the keys. Moonlight from a tall, arched window silvered her upswept hair and the simple lines of her dark velvet gown. Scattered around the piano stool were loose sheets of manuscript paper, covered in a flurry of hastily scribbled notes. She was not playing for an audience. She was playing for herself, giving voice to something locked deep within. Anton stood, concealed by the shadows of the doorway, utterly transfixed. He felt like an intruder, a witness to a sacred and intensely private rite. He did not breathe. He only listened. The waltz swelled, a confession of longing, a dance of a caged bird beating its wings against gilded bars. It spoke of a soul that yearned for a world larger than the one it was permitted to inhabit. It was not merely music, he thought, a tremor passing through him. It was a confession, a voice in a language I had been waiting my entire life to hear. Suddenly, a harsh voice sliced through the spell. "Charlotte, what did I tell you about this display?" The music stopped, a final unresolved chord hanging in the air like a ghost. The woman at the piano flinched as if struck. A man stepped out from another doorway, his figure eclipsing the moonlight. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his face a mask of stern possession. Anton recognized him instantly. Count Leopold von Schreiber, a diplomat whose ambition was matched only by his rigid adherence to propriety. "My dear," the Count continued, his tone a silken threat, "such passionate compositions are best kept for private amusement. A diplomat's wife must be a vessel of poise, not turmoil." Charlotte rose slowly from the piano bench. As she turned, Anton saw her face for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was a fragile, haunted beauty. Her eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, were wide and startled, and in their depths he saw the same profound sadness he had heard in her music. Her gaze swept the room and for a single heart-stopping second locked with his. In that fleeting moment, an entire conversation passed between them. He saw her shock at being discovered, the shame warring with a desperate plea for understanding. She saw in his eyes not judgment, but a reflection of her own music, an awestruck, reverent admiration that bordered on worship. It was a connection so immediate, so potent, that it left them both breathless. The Count, oblivious, took her arm in a grip that was just a fraction too tight. "Come, people will notice your absence." He led her from the room, his presence a chilling negation of the warmth her music had created. Anton remained in the shadows, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The salon was empty now, the silence screaming where the music had been. He stepped forward, towards the piano. The air still seemed to vibrate with that final broken chord. On the polished wood of the Palais, next to the scattered sheets of her soul, lay a single, perfect white rose, already beginning to wilt in the oppressive heat of the house. He reached out a trembling hand but did not touch it. It was her, he thought, beautiful, pure, and slowly dying in a place where it could not truly bloom. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone, but the melody, her melody, was now imprinted on his soul, a wound and a promise. The days that followed the gala were a torment of echoes for Anton. The ghost of Charlotte's waltz haunted his waking hours and bled into his dreams. The vapid tunes he was paid to play felt like profanities against the memory of her music. He tried to recreate the melody, his fingers fumbling on the keys of his own worn-out piano, but he could only capture fragments, like trying to reconstruct a dream upon waking. The waltz was more than a sequence of notes. It was her very essence, and he was consumed by the need to hear it again, to understand the soul from which it had sprung. Vienna's musical circles were a tightly woven, incestuous web, and with a few discreet inquiries, fueled by a desperation that surprised him, Anton found his connection. A cellist in an orchestra he occasionally conducted knew the von Schreiber family. With a carefully constructed lie about his interest in commissioning a simple parlour piece for a wealthy patron, Anton secured an introduction. The pretext was flimsy, but it was the only key he could find to unlock her world. Their first correspondence was excruciatingly formal. Stiff third-person notes delivered by footmen, discussing potential themes and styles with a sterile propriety that felt like a betrayal of the music that connected them. Yet even in these stilted exchanges, Anton searched for the woman from the salon. The Count von Schreiber presents his compliments to Herr Heller and conveys on behalf of his fiancée, Fräulein Charlotte von Weisberg, her availability to discuss the proposed commission at her family's residence next Tuesday. He had gone, of course, to her family home, a grand, cold mausoleum of a house where the clock seemed to tick louder than any conversation. The Count had remained for the entire meeting, a silent, watchful presence, his possessiveness a palpable force in the room. Charlotte had been quiet, withdrawn, a pale echo of the woman he had seen at the piano. But when she spoke of music, a flicker of the fire returned. She spoke of harmonic structure and melodic development with a technical brilliance that humbled him. They were speaking in code using the language of theory to touch upon the truths of the soul. It was Charlotte who, in a moment of daring, suggested a different arrangement. In a letter smuggled to him via her sympathetic lady's maid, she proposed that sending notes back and forth was inefficient. It would be far more practical, she argued, for her to visit his apartment for rehearsals where they could work directly at the piano. It was a breathtaking risk, a deliberate step into forbidden territory, and so their clandestine meetings began. Anton's apartment, a modest set of rooms above a luthier's shop, was a world away from the gilded cage she inhabited. It was cluttered with stacks of manuscript paper, smelling of rosin, old books, and the cheap coffee he perpetually brewed. Here, in the quiet intimacy of this candle-lit space, she began to unfurl. The pretext of the commission was quickly forgotten. On her first visit, she brought with her the scattered, ink-stained pages he had seen by the Pleyel. "It is unfinished," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she laid them on his piano. "I do not know how to end it." That was the beginning. He did not presume to compose for her, but he became her confidant, her mirror. He would play a passage back to her, questioning a chord change, suggesting a different voicing. "What are you trying to say here, Charlotte?" he would ask, and the question would unlock a torrent of musical ideas from her. Their hands would brush over the keys, sending shivers through them both that had nothing to do with the winter chill. They sat so close on the worn piano bench that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. The vibrations of a powerful chord would travel from the piano frame, through the floorboards, and into their very bones, a shared physical experience that was achingly intimate. The air between them grew thick, electric with unspoken feelings, with the dangerous, beautiful truth of what was happening. Their letters, now delivered through the trusted maid, shed their formal skins. They were no longer about music theory, but about everything music represented. They became confessions. "With you," she wrote, the ink bleeding slightly on the cheap parchment, as if from the pressure of her emotion, "I feel I am not merely playing notes, but speaking the truth of my soul. This waltz, it is no longer just mine, it has become ours." During one rehearsal, bathed in the cool moonlight spilling through his garret window, she faltered mid-phrase. He looked at her and saw tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "He wants me to stop," she said, her voice choked. "Leopold, he says my compositions are unseemly, that my only role is to be a reflection of his status, a beautiful object on his arm." She looked around Anton's chaotic, impoverished room. "He wants to buy me a new piano, a Bechstein, as a wedding gift. He thinks it will placate me. But it will be a coffin, Anton, a beautiful, polished coffin for my music." Anton's heart ached with a fierce, protective anger. He reached out, his fingers gently covering hers on the keys, stilling their trembling. "Your music deserves to be heard in concert halls, not balanced in drawing rooms," he said, his voice low and intense. "Don't let him extinguish your fire, Charlotte. It is the most brilliant light I have ever seen." She turned her head, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. The space between them collapsed into a single shared breath. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. The longing was a physical presence in the room, a silent, powerful chord that resonated deeper than any music they had played. The moonlight illuminated the scattered sheets of her waltz. a testament to the secret, fragile world they'd built together, a universe of ink and ivory, of shared glances and whispered truths, hidden away from the cold, clamorous reality that waited to reclaim her. The announcement arrived like a death knell, printed in elegant, merciless script on a heavy cream card. Count Leopold von Schreiber and Fräulein Charlotte von Weisberg request the honour of your presence at their wedding on the 20th of May. The date, less than a month away, hung in the air between them during their next meeting, a guillotine blade suspended over their fragile world. The reality of their situation, a reality they had managed to hold at bay within the four walls of Anton's apartment, crashed down with suffocating force. Vienna, once a city of furtive, romantic possibility, now felt like a labyrinth with no exit, its grand boulevards and cobbled alleys all leading to the inescapable fact of her wedding. The Count, as if sensing a shift in the currents of his fiancée's heart, grew more possessive. His visits to her family home became more frequent, his eyes holding a new, sharpened suspicion. Charlotte's movements were curtailed, her free time filled with dress fittings, meetings with caterers, and endless social obligations designed to mould her into the perfect Countess von Schreiber. The door to her gilded cage was being locked, the key turned by the unyielding hand of societal expectation. Their clandestine meetings, once a source of expansive creative joy, became frantic, stolen moments fraught with the very real danger of discovery. The music they made together changed. The lyrical, melancholic beauty of the waltz gave way to passages that were turbulent, dissonant. They argued over chord progressions and tempos, their artistic disagreements a proxy for the rage and despair they could not otherwise express. The piano became their battlefield, the 88 keys their arsenal. One evening, after a week of agonizing silence during which Charlotte had been unable to get away, she finally appeared at his door, her face pale and drawn. She told him the Count had questioned her at length about her musical project, his inquiries thinly veiled accusations. A furious, helpless energy surged through Anton. It was a despair that bordered on madness, a romantic agony so profound it could no longer be contained by silence and demanded to be given voice. While she watched, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, he sat at the piano, but he did not play her waltz. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of sound that was entirely his own. He began to play a sonata he had been composing in the lonely, silent hours of her absence. It was a fiery, almost violent piece, a direct response to her waltz. Where her music was a lament of confinement, his was a roar of rebellion. It was the sound of a storm breaking, of chains rattling, of a heart raging against the bars of an unjust world. The chords were crashing, discordant, filled with his longing for her and his hatred for the man who was stealing her. He played until sweat beaded on his forehead, until his fingers ached, pouring every ounce of his frustration, his love, and his despair into the music. When he finished, the final angry chord echoing in the small room, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. Charlotte was weeping, not with sadness, but with a kind of terrible shared understanding. "That," she whispered, her voice trembling, "is how my soul feels." That was the night they both knew might be their last. The risk had become too great. The near miss happened 2 days later. Anton, in a fit of recklessness, had sent a short note directly to her house, a simple "Are you safe?" scrawled on a scrap of paper. The note, intercepted by a nosy parlour maid, was delivered not to Charlotte but to her mother. It was only by a stroke of desperate genius that Charlotte, seeing the note in her mother's hand, had claimed it was from her music copyist, inquiring about a smudge on a recent transcription. The lie was flimsy, but it held, if only barely. The scare was a brutal shock of cold water. That evening, a frantic, tear-blotted message arrived from Charlotte via the usual channel. We cannot meet again, it is too dangerous. I will be watched. Do not write. I will find a way to contact you when I can. Forgive me. See. Anton read the note, and the world fell away. He was left in a void. The music brutally silenced. He stared out his window at the city lights, but they seemed distant, cold stars in an alien sky. He tried to write a response to plead with her, but a sudden cold autumn rain began to fall, the drops spattering against the window pane, blurring the world outside. He watched as a single drop landed on the letter he was attempting, smearing the wet ink of her name into an unrecognizable black tear. The ticking of the clock on his mantelpiece was a monstrous thing, each second a hammer blow, counting down to the day she would be lost to him forever. She has left me in a world without music, he thought, the despair a physical weight in his chest. Only the screaming silence remains. To live without her melody is to not live at all. The eve of her wedding arrived with a tempest. A furious autumn storm broke over Vienna, lashing the city with wind and a torrential, freezing rain. The sky was a bruised purple-black, and the gaslights on the street below Anton's window hissed and sputtered, their light haloed and distorted by the deluge. The storm was a perfect mirror for the chaos raging within him. His apartment, once their sanctuary, had become his crucible. For days he had paced its floors, the silence broken only by the frantic, dissonant chords he would slam out on the piano before lapsing back into a stupor of grief. The scattered sheets of her waltz lay on the rug before the cold fireplace, a cruel reminder of all he was about to lose. He was staring into the dying embers of the fire when a frantic pounding on his door ripped through the sound of the storm. He froze. No one ever came to his door this late, this violently. For a wild, impossible moment, he thought it might be the Count, come to enact some kind of brutal vengeance. He pulled the door open, and she was there. Charlotte. She was a wraith, a creature born of the storm. Her fine travelling cloak was soaked through, plastered to her body. Her carefully coiffed hair had come undone, strands of it clinging to her pale, rain-streaked face. Her eyes, wide and wild, burned with a desperate, feverish light. She stood on his threshold, trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer, terrifying force of her own rebellion. She did not need to speak. The story was in her flight, in the raw terror and defiant hope warring in her gaze. He reached out, his hand closing around her arm, and pulled her inside, out of the raging night and into the fragile shelter of his room. He kicked the door shut, plunging them into the dim, firelit intimacy of the space. The dam of their restraint, built over months of stolen glances and unspoken words, did not just break. It shattered into a million pieces. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking the cold, wet skin of her cheeks. Her name was a prayer on his lips, Charlotte. She surged forward, her mouth finding his in a kiss that was not gentle or tender, but a frantic, desperate collision. It tasted of rain and tears and a sorrow so profound it threatened to drown them both. It was a kiss of starvation, the desperate act of two souls who had been denied their only true nourishment. His arms wrapped around her, crushing her to him, as if he could absorb her into himself, protect her from the world she had just fled. The kiss deepened, the initial frenzy softening into something more profound, an exploration of a truth they had for so long denied. This was not just a physical act. It was the final, inevitable resolution of their music. It was a reclaiming. For her, it was the violent, passionate seizure of her own body, her own desire, from the cold, transactional fate of her engagement. For him, it was the worship of the artist, the genius he had revered from afar, now made real and vulnerable in his arms. His hands moved from her face to the fastenings of her cloak. The wet wool fell away, pooling at her feet. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his fingers trembling as they worked the tiny pearl buttons of her dress. Each layer of fabric he peeled away felt like stripping back a layer of societal expectation, of suffocating propriety, until she stood before him in the flickering firelight, clad only in her thin chemise. The scent of rain and damp fabric gave way to the warm, intoxicating scent of her skin. He knelt before her, his hands tracing the lines of her body through the fine linen, learning her form as if it were a sacred piece of music. Her initial shivers of cold turned to shivers of desire as his mouth found hers again, then travelled down the long, elegant line of her throat to the hollow of her collarbone. There was a raw, almost painful vulnerability in their impending nakedness. Every touch was both a question and an answer, every glance a confession. "Anton," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread of sound. He rose and lifted her into his arms, carrying her the few steps to the worn rug before the fireplace. He laid her down amidst the scattered pages of her own waltz, the notes that had brought them together, now a witness to their final desperate union. He stripped away his own clothes, the act swift and urgent, until there was nothing left between them. Skin met skin, and a collective gasp of discovery escaped their lips. His movements were a reflection of their music, a slow lyrical adagio at first. His hands and mouth explored her with a reverence that bordered on divine worship, mapping the curve of her hip, the softness of her belly, the swell of her body. He whispered her name against her skin, a mantra, a prayer, an incantation. He was not taking. He was being given a gift of unimaginable praise, and he treated it as such. When he finally moved toward her, she guided him with her hands, her eyes locked on his. The moment of their joining was a soft, perfect shock, harmony so complete it made them both cry out. He began to move with her slowly, savouring the way her body arched to meet his, the way her fingers dug into the muscles of his back. The tempo quickened, building from adagio to a driving, passionate allegro. Their bodies found their rhythm, a dance of need and surrender, of reverence and raw hunger. The firelight danced on their skin, slick with sweat, casting their intertwined shadows large and monstrous on the wall. The storm raged outside, a wild orchestra to their private symphony. Her release came upon her with the force of a tidal wave, a sob tearing from her throat, a sound of sublime pleasure and profound, shattering grief for the beautiful, impossible life they could never have. His own climax followed, a white-hot wave of release that left him utterly spent. He collapsed against her, holding her tightly as their shared climax washed over them, their heartbeats a frantic, decelerating drumbeat against each other's chests. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a perfect and tragic harmony struck in defiance of a world that would never understand its beauty. They awoke not to the violence of the storm, but to the hushed, fragile stillness that follows it. The rain had ceased. A pale grey light, the first hint of dawn filtered through the garret window, washing the world in shades of pearl and ash. It was a world washed clean, new and uncertain. They lay tangled in each other's arms on the rug, the fire now a bed of softly glowing embers, the scattered pages of the waltz a testament to the night's wreckage and creation. The fevered passion had settled into a deep, tender intimacy. His arm was draped protectively over her waist, her head nestled in the crook of his shoulder. There were no more words to be said, no frantic confessions left to make. There was only the quiet, immutable truth of their bodies pressed together, and the unspoken question of what came next. They both knew a decision had to be made, a path chosen in the stark light of this new day. It was Charlotte who spoke first, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "I cannot go back," she said, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I will not." It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. In the crucible of their night together, a new strength had been forged within her. She was no longer running away from the Count, She was running towards a life of her own making, whatever the cost. Poverty, scandal, ostracism, they were all preferable to the gilded silence that awaited her. Anton tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss into her hair. He felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost choked him, mingled with the sharp, piercing grief of what her decision meant for them. Her freedom meant his loss. Before the city outside truly began to stir, as the first sounds of cartwheels on wet cobblestones drifted up from the street below, they made love one last time. This was not the desperate, fevered claiming of the night before. This was something else entirely. Gentle, knowing and deeply melancholic. It was a farewell. His touch was an act of memorization, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine, the line of her jaw, imprinting the feel of her into his being. Each kiss was a promise to remember. Her response was a quiet, total surrender to the moment, a conscious act of recording the sensation of his skin against hers, the weight of his body on hers, the specific timbre of his whisper against her ear. It was a tender, heartbreakingly beautiful act of closure, an acknowledgement that this physical union was all they might ever have. They were sealing their connection even as they accepted the necessity of their separate paths, creating a final, perfect memory to sustain them through the years of silence that would follow. When she was dressed, her damp cloak her only possession, she took a pen from his desk. On the cover page of her waltz, she crossed out the simple title she'd given it and wrote in her elegant, decisive hand, "Our Waltz." She handed the completed score to him. "Promise me," she said, her sea-storm eyes meeting his, clear and resolute. "Promise me it will be heard." "I promise," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She left him with a final lingering kiss and a note, a simple address in a modest district of Prague. She would not put him in danger by staying in Vienna. She would not be a scandal that would ruin him. She would simply disappear and begin again. He watched from his window as her small figure, shrouded in the grey cloak, was swallowed by the morning mist, leaving him alone with her musters and the ghost of her touch. Months bled into a year. The scandal of the jilted Count von Schreiber and his runaway fiancée was a brief, delicious morsel for Viennese society, quickly consumed and replaced by fresher gossip. Anton, driven by a new and relentless purpose, threw himself into his work. His grief and longing were sublimated into a fierce ambition, not for himself, but for her. He used every connection, called in every favour. His former cynicism burned away by the fire of his promise. The final scene took place on a crisp autumn evening, a year to the day of the storm. Anton Heller, no longer a weary pianist for hire, but a respected conductor, stood on the podium of the Musikverein. The grand concert hall was a cavern of gold and crimson packed with the very society that would have condemned her. He looked out at the expectant faces, a sea of strangers, and felt a profound, secret satisfaction. He raised his baton. A hush fell over the hall. He gave the downbeat, and the first notes of the waltz filled the air. It began with the cellos, a sound as deep and melancholic as he remembered it from that first night, before the violins picked up the haunting, limping, beautiful melody. The orchestra played with a passion Anton had demanded of them. He conducted with his entire being, his body swaying to the rhythm they had created together, his eyes closed as he lost himself in the music. It swelled and soared, no longer a secret whispered in a darkened room, but a bold, triumphant declaration. It was her soul, her fire, her voice finally unleashed upon the world. As the final powerful chord echoed through the hall, the audience was stunned into a moment of silence before erupting into thunderous applause. Anton lowered his baton, his chest heaving, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, and he saw her. In the shadows of a high private box, a woman stood alone. Her face was serene, unadorned, and in her eyes he saw not the haunted sadness of the girl he had met, but the quiet, confident strength of the woman she had become. She was free. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a shared secret across the crowded hall. And so the waltz played on, no longer a confession, but a testament to a love that chose not to be silent, to a soul that refused to be caged, and to the courageous, transformative power of a single, perfect note of truth. It was a promise echoing in the heart of Vienna, their symphony complete at last. The ocean knows her name. The thrift shop was a tomb of forgotten things, smelling of dust, decaying paper, and the faint, sweet perfume of ghosts. For Camilla Brooks, it was a mausoleum for her own life, a place she entered on a lunch break she felt a biting guilt for taking. Every second away from her desk was a small act of rebellion, and each rebellion was paid for with a currency of anxiety that left her perpetually exhausted. Her life was a series of obligations stitched together with the thread of other people's expectations, and the fabric was beginning to fray. She ran her fingers along the spines of books, the brittle paper a scent that anchored her to 1,000 other lives, all more interesting than her own. Her hand stopped on a tattered volume of sea poems, its cover the faded blue of a twilight sky. It was a compulsion, the kind that had begun to govern her small acts of defiance. She bought it without a second thought, the few coins a pittance for the weight of it in her hands, a small solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her day. Back in the oppressive hum of the city, locked in the sterile silence of her cubicle, she opened it. Tucked inside, between verses of longing and brine, was a letter. The paper was thick and creamy, the ink faded to the colour of a dried bloodstain. It was not addressed to a person, but to an idea, a soul she recognised with a jolt that was both terror and homecoming. "To the girl who dreams of salt air," it began. The words that followed spoke not of a story, but of a promise, a place where the tide remembers, and where a part of her was waiting to be reclaimed. On the back, a hand-drawn map, elegant and archaic, detailed a coastal route to a village named Port Blossom. "This is insane," she whispered to the silent office, the words swallowed by the air-conditioned hush. "I'm chasing a ghost from a dead woman's letter." The thought was a splash of cold water, a dose of the sensibility that had been drilled into her since birth. She was Camilla Brooks, the sensible one, the reliable one, the one who answered the phone and paid the bills and never, ever did anything as reckless as following a phantom map. But what if the ghost was her, the part of her she had buried under years of pleasing others, the wild, salt-sprayed girl who existed only in the fleeting, vivid dreams that left her aching with an indefinable loss upon waking? The decision, when it came, was not a decision at all. It was a surrender. She called in sick, her voice a stranger's in her own ears, calm and steady as she lied. She packed a small bag, the contents a rebellion in themselves, not the sensible shoes and practical cardigans of her daily life, but a soft, flowing dress, a book of poetry she had never read, and a deep, reckless hope. She followed the map, the city's oppressive hum gradually replaced by the lonely cry of a seagull, the air growing sharp and clean with the promise of the sea. The taste of salt was on her lips the moment she stepped out of her car, a baptism. Port Blossom was a place carved from sea-bleached wood and stone, a village that seemed to have risen from the ocean itself. It was unsettlingly quiet, the air heavy with brine and secrets. The few villagers she saw, an old woman mending nets, her fingers gnarled as driftwood, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch with a slow, rhythmic grace, did not look at her with the surprise of a stranger's arrival. They looked at her with a kind of gentle recognition, their eyes holding a deep, ancient knowing that sent a shiver down her spine. Then a man emerged from the fog-dusted boatyard, a silhouette against the grey mist. He was weathered, his face a testament to a life lived in communion with the elements, his eyes the colour of the sea just before a storm. He carried himself with a quiet, rooted strength, as if he were as much a part of this landscape as the cliffs and the churning water. He didn't introduce himself, offered no conventional greeting. He simply looked at her, and the world for Camilla tilted on its axis. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice the low rumble of a distant tide. "You took longer than I dreamed." His name was Elliot, and his cottage was an extension of himself, a place of quiet strength and gentle mystery. It was filled with driftwood art, the smooth, sea-worn wood shaped into figures of impossible grace. Nautical charts papered the walls, maps of depths and currents that seemed to mirror the hidden landscapes of the soul. The air smelled of beeswax and chamomile tea, a scent that was at once grounding and ethereal. For Camilla, who had lived her life in spaces designed for utility and appearance, it was a revelation. This was a home, not a house. Elliot showed her around the village, his presence a comforting anchor in the disorienting magic of Port Blossom. He spoke of shared memories, moments that had lived only in the landscape of his dreams, yet which felt more real to Camilla than her own carefully curated past. He spoke of her laughing as she ran from the waves, of a time he'd found her crying by the cliffs, the salt of her tears indistinguishable from the spray of the sea. He pointed to a small weathered cottage with a door the colour of a summer sky and said, "You always loved the blue door." Camilla found herself torn between the sharp, insistent voice of logical disbelief and a deep feeling of homecoming that resonated in her very bones. "How can you know me?" she asked, the words a whisper against the sound of the waves crashing on the shore below. "The real me? I barely know her." Elliot's storm-grey eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw a reflection of a self she had only ever glimpsed in fleeting moments of quiet rebellion. "I don't know the you who answers the phone and pays the bills," he said, his voice gentle. "I know the you who hums when she thinks she's alone, the one who tastes the rain and isn't afraid of the storm." Later, in the flickering candlelight of his cottage, he showed her the journals. They were filled with sketches of her face rendered with a tender, aching familiarity that made her breath catch in her throat. The drawings captured expressions she had never seen in a mirror, yet recognized as her own. A fleeting look of sorrow, a flash of wild joy, a deep contemplative stillness. Alongside the sketches were detailed accounts of their meetings in his sleep, his dreams a tapestry of shared moments that defied all logic. He described a small crescent-shaped scar on her palm, a pale silver line she had gotten as a child, a secret she had never shared with anyone. The sight of it, sketched with such unnerving accuracy, was the final undoing of her carefully constructed defences. For the first time in her life, Camilla spoke the truth of her own heart. She confessed the suffocating weight of her existence, the feeling of being an actress in a play she had never auditioned for. She spoke of the constant pressure to be the sensible one, the anchor for a family that seemed to thrive on her quiet sacrifices. Elliot listened with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes, he simply shared her silence, his presence a testament to a connection that transcended words. As they walked along the shore at sunset, the wild, wind-swept beach, a canvas of bruised purples and fiery oranges, their hands brushed. The touch was electric, a jolt of recognition that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. It was not the tentative, polite touch of a stranger, but the familiar, charged contact of two souls who had been circling each other for a lifetime. He picked up a piece of sea glass, its surface smooth and cool against her skin, and placed it in her palm, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "The ocean has a rhythm," he said, his voice a low murmur against the roar of the waves. "A memory. You are a part of its song." The sound of their footsteps in the wet sand, one hesitant, one sure, was the only answer she could give. She looked at the man beside her, a man she had met only a day before yet had known for an eternity. The sea glass in her hand was a tangible piece of this impossible reality, a promise of a life she had only ever dared to dream. And as the last light of the sun bled into the horizon, she felt the first stirrings of a surrender that was not a defeat, but a homecoming. The call from reality came on a stormy, rain-lashed night, the world outside the cottage windows a maelstrom of wind and water. The life Camilla had fled reasserted its hold with the shrill, insistent ring of her phone, a sound as alien in the quiet of Port Blossom as a scream in a cathedral. It was her sister, her voice a frantic, guilt-inducing torrent of words. Their mother was unwell, a familiar manipulation, a weapon her family had wielded with devastating precision for years. A crisis at work, a project only Camilla could handle, demanded her immediate return. Each word was a nail, hammering the lid on the coffin of her brief, beautiful fantasy. The seeds of doubt, planted in the fertile ground of a lifetime of conditioning, began to sprout. She confronted Elliot, her fear and logic battling the quiet, insistent magic of the village. The relentless drumming of rain against the window pane was a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. "This isn't real," she insisted, her voice tight with a rising panic. "People don't just dream each other into existence. You're a charlatan. Or worse, you're a madman." Elliot did not flinch, did not argue. He simply watched her, his sea-storm eyes filled with a sorrow that was more devastating than any anger. The fierce storm that had rolled in from the ocean mirrored Camilla's inner turmoil, the sea a violent, churning force that seemed to mock the fragile peace she had found. The villagers, in their calm, almost reverent acceptance of the storm's fury, unnerved her further. They battened down the hatches, their faces serene, as if the rage of the ocean was a familiar, necessary part of their world. Elliot asked her to trust what she felt, not what she thought she knew. "I want to believe you," she said, her voice breaking, the words torn from the deepest, most conflicted part of her. "God, I want this to be my life. But I have responsibilities. I have a life that exists outside this fairy tale." His quiet response was a blade that slipped between her ribs. "Is it a fairy tale, or is that the nightmare you've been telling yourself is real?" Shaken and confused, the cold, dead weight of her phone in her hand a portal to a world she no longer recognized, Camilla retreated. "I'm leaving in the morning," she told him, the words tasting of ash in her mouth. His quiet heartbreak was a physical blow. He didn't try to stop her, didn't plead or argue. He simply stood by the window, a silhouette against the storm-tossed darkness, and said, "The ocean will miss you. So will I." He pressed the letter, her letter, the one that had brought her here, back into her hand, its creamy paper a tangible reminder of the ghost she was once again choosing to abandon. The ghost of herself. The smell of ozone from the storm filled the air, a scent that was at once clean and destructive. Camilla went to her room, the sound of the relentless rain a funeral drum mourning the death of a life she had only just begun to live. The pre-dawn gloom was heavy and still, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the ghosts of the night storm. Camilla sat in her car, the engine a low, mournful hum, her hands clenched on the steering wheel. She was ready to drive away, to retreat back into the suffocating embrace of her old life, the life that had been slowly, methodically erasing her. But the letter, the one Elliot had pressed back into her hand, lay on the seat beside her, a silent, insistent plea. She reread it, the faded ink a testament to a promise she had almost broken. This time she saw it not as a curiosity, a romantic whim, but as a desperate message from her own soul. The final line, which she had previously dismissed as a poetic flourish, now screamed at her, a clarion call from the deepest part of her being. Don't let them make you forget the roar. In a moment of transformative, blinding clarity, she understood. The people-pleasing, the endless, soul-crushing accommodations had not been kindness. It was a slow, deliberate erasure of self. Staying in Port Blossom wasn't an escape, it was a reclamation. She got out of the car, the cool damp air a shock against her skin, and walked, then almost ran back to Elliot's cottage. She found him by the window watching the sea, a solitary, timeless figure against the bruised dawn. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her eyes, her heart, her very soul spoke for her. He turned, and the space between them crackled with a lifetime of unspoken longing, a raw, elemental hunger that defied words. He didn't move to her, but waited, a silent invitation, letting her close the final distance. When she reached him, her hands came up to cup his face, her touch both a question and a statement, a surrender and a claiming. His hands found her waist, pulling her flush against him with a groan that was torn from the depths of his being. The kiss was not gentle, it was a collision of storm and shore, a desperate, drowning relief. His mouth tasted of salt and coffee and a want so profound it stole her breath. Her name was a broken prayer on his lips, a sound that was both a reverence and a possession. Camilla! Clothes melted away in the dim pre-dawn light, a silent, urgent shedding of skins. The rough texture of his fisherman's sweater scraped against her cheek, a fleeting, tactile anchor in the maelstrom of sensation. Her skin was a shock of heat against his, a testament to the fire that had been smouldering beneath the surface for a lifetime. He laid her down on the thick sheepskin rug before the cold hearth, the rough wool essential contrast to the smoothness of her skin. His body was a reverent weight upon hers, his exploration slow, deliberate, a cartographer mapping a beloved, long-lost land. He worshipped her with his mouth and his hands, tracing the lines of her body with a reverence that made her tremble. His fingers, calloused from a life of hard work, were surprisingly gentle as they explored the secret, hidden places of her, his touch a language that spoke of a deep, ancient knowing. His tongue, hot and wet, followed the path of his hands, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. He licked and tasted and devoured her, his hunger a testament to the years of dreaming, of waiting. She arched and trembled, her breath catching in ragged sobs of pleasure that were both an agony and an ecstasy. The crescent-shaped scar on her palm, the one he had sketched in his journal, was a focal point, a place where his lips lingered, his tongue tracing the pale silvery line as if it were a sacred text. And then there was no space left between them, only a single shared breath. It was a deep, profound homecoming. There was no fumbling, no awkwardness, only the sure, inevitable joining of two halves of a whole. He moved with a rhythm that mirrored the tide, a slow, powerful pull and a deep, shattering release. Her moans were swallowed by his mouth, their bodies slick with sweat and desire, intertwined in a dance as old as time. Every touch was a confirmation, a physical conversation that affirmed a bond their spirits had recognized from the very first glance. The climax was a shared, shuddering wave that left them breathless and clinging to one another, the scent of the extinguished fire in the hearth, a faint, smoky perfume in the cool, damp air, finally, blessedly anchored. Camilla woke to the soft, golden light of a new day, the storm of the previous night a distant memory. She was tangled in Elliot's arms, his body a warm, solid presence against hers. For the first time in her adult life, she felt no guilt, no anxiety, only a deep, resonant peace that settled in her bones and quieted the frantic hum that had been the soundtrack to her existence. She watched him sleep, the fierce lines of his face softened, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm that matched the gentle lapping of the tide on the shore outside. She was home. She made one final phone call, her voice calm and unshakable, a stark contrast to the frantic, pleading tones of her sister on the other end of the line. She didn't fight or explain, didn't offer excuses or apologies. She simply resigned from her job, from her role as the family fixer, from the life that had been slowly, inexorably squeezing the life out of her. She was polite but firm, the connection severed with a quiet finality that left her sister speechless. Later, she and Elliot walked through the village, hand in hand, the bright, clean scent of the sea air after the storm, a promise of a new beginning. The villagers, who had once regarded her with a gentle, knowing silence, now greeted her with open smiles. The old woman mending nets looked up as they passed and pressed a small, intricately woven bracelet of twine into Camilla's hand. "Welcome home," she said, her voice the soft rustle of dry leaves. Camilla looked at the faces around her, at the quiet, deep-set joy in their eyes, and understood. This wasn't just Elliot's dream, it was the village's. She was a missing piece, and now she'd returned. That night they made love again, the warmth of the sun on her skin a lingering memory. This time it was different. The desperate, drowning hunger of their first encounter was replaced by a deep, playful tenderness. It was slow and knowing, full of laughter and whispered secrets. He kissed the crescent-shaped scar on her palm, a silent acknowledgement of the shared past that had finally, blessedly become their present. She traced the lines on his face, the lines she had known forever, a cartographer of a beloved, familiar landscape. It was a love that felt both ancient and brand new, a promise kept across the realms of dream and reality. The comfortable weight of Elliot's hand in hers was an anchor, a grounding force in a world that had once seemed a chaotic, storm-tossed sea. She had spent her life pleasing others, only to discover that her true self had been waiting for her in a place she had only ever visited in dreams. The greatest love stories, she now understood, are not written by us, but are currents we must be brave enough to follow. And so she learned that the heart is not a compass that points you to a new land, but an anchor that holds you to the one place you were always meant to be. The ocean knew her name, and now, finally, so did she. A rose for every year. The little seaside town clung to the cliffs of the English coast like a child to its mother's skirts, braced against the ceaseless wind that swept in from the grey-green expanse of the North Sea. It was a place of salt-stung air, of hardy, wind-swept roses that grew in defiant clusters along the cliff paths, and of people whose lives were as inextricably linked to the tides as the seaweed that lay in tangled ribbons on the shore. It was the late 40s, a time of quiet rebuilding, of a hope that was as fragile and as precious as the first light of dawn after a long and starless night. It was in this town that Helen first saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a beginning. She was a girl with eyes the colour of the sea on a summer's day, a spirit as untamed as the gulls that wheeled and cried in the vast open sky. She had come to the town to sketch, to capture the raw wild beauty of the cliffs, the endless shifting moods of the water. She sat on a narrow ledge of rock, her sketchbook open on her lap, the charcoal a smudge of black against her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to capture the way the light fell on the churning water below. She was so lost in her work that she didn't notice the sky darkening, the wind picking up, whipping her hair across her face until the first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the pages of her sketchbook. A sudden squall had rolled in from the sea, a common occurrence in this part of the world, but it had caught her unawares. She gathered her things, her heart sinking as she saw the smudged lines of her drawing, the delicate shading now a blur of grey. It was then that she saw him. He was making his way up the cliff path, a tall, sturdy figure in a thick woolen sweater and heavy boots, his face weathered by the sun and the salt spray. He moved with the quiet, steady assurance of a man who knew the sea, who understood its moods and its tempers. He was a fisherman, she guessed, one of the men who went out in the boats at dawn and returned at dusk, their faces etched with the stories of the deep. He saw her huddled against the rock, trying to shield her sketchbook from the rain, and he walked over to her. He didn't say a word, just shrugged off his heavy coat and held it over her, creating a small temporary shelter from the storm. She looked up at him, surprised, and saw a kindness in his eyes that was as warm and as steady as the light from a distant lighthouse. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. He just nodded, his eyes on the sea. "It will pass," he said, his voice a low rumble, like the sound of the waves on the shore. "It always does." And in that moment, something shifted in Helen. She had always seen the sea as a thing of wild, untamable beauty, a force of nature to be admired from a distance. But in the quiet strength of this man, in the simple, selfless gesture of his coat, she saw something else. She saw a harbour. He looked at me not as a storm to be weathered, she thought, but as a sea to be known. And in his eyes, I saw the promise of a calm harbour. The squall passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air clean and sharp, the rocks glistening with rain. He walked her back to the little cottage she was renting, his coat still draped over her shoulders. He told her his name was Thomas, and she told him hers was Helen. They walked in a comfortable silence, the only sound the cry of the gulls and the distant rhythmic roar of the sea. A few days later she went back to the same spot on the cliffs. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the sea a calm, glittering expanse of silver and gold. She found him there, waiting for her. He was holding a single perfect white rose, its petals still beaded with dew. "I picked it for you," he said, his voice shy, his gaze steady. "From the bushes on the cliff." He held it out to her, and as she took it, her fingers brushed against his. A jolt, like a spark of static electricity, passed between them. "It's beautiful," she whispered, lifting the rose to her face, inhaling its delicate sweet scent. "It's for the love I felt the moment I saw you," he confessed, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. And as she did, he kissed her. It was a gentle, hesitant kiss, a question and an answer all in one. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and roses, of hope and beginnings. It was a kiss that sealed their fate. 1 year later they stood on the same cliff, the same endless sky above them, the same sea whispering its secrets below. He gave her 2 roses this time, one red and one white. "One for passion," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and one for the love that holds it, for as long as I have you." He knelt on one knee, the rugged cliffs and the boundless sea as witness, and asked her to be his wife. And Helen, her heart so full it felt like it would burst, laughed a laugh that mingled with the sound of the waves, and said yes. The 1950s and 60s unfolded for Thomas and Helen, in a tapestry woven with the bright threads of joy and the darker, more sombre threads of struggle. Their little cottage, perched on the edge of the cliffs, was no longer a quiet retreat, but a place filled with the noise and warmth of a growing family. They had a son, James, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's artistic soul, and a daughter, Sarah, with her mother's sea-green eyes and a spirit as free as the gulls. The cottage was a place of sensory delights, a haven against the wildness of the sea. The air was thick with the scent of Helen's baking, a constant comforting aroma of bread and apple crumble and gingerbread that clung to the curtains and seeped into the very walls of the house. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the small rooms, mingling with the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the rhythmic, relentless sound of the tide, a constant, soothing presence in the background of their lives. The anniversary tradition continued, a quiet anchor in the whirlwind of their busy lives. Every year, on the anniversary of the day he had proposed, Thomas would bring Helen a red rose and a white rose, a simple, heartfelt symbol of the love that had taken root on that windswept cliff and had blossomed in the fertile ground of their shared life. But as the years passed, the subtle, creeping pressures of life began to create a distance between them, a distance as intangible and as vast as the horizon that separated the sea and the sky. Thomas was often away for long stretches on the fishing boats, his life dictated by the tides and the seasons. He would return, his body weary, his hands rough and calloused, his mind still filled with the roar of the sea, and find it difficult to adjust to the quiet rhythms of domestic life. Helen, in turn, felt the weight of her dreams deferred. Her sketchbooks lay gathering dust on a shelf, her charcoals untouched, her artistic ambitions slowly fading like an old photograph. She loved her children, her home, her life, but there was a part of her that longed for the wild, untamed beauty of the cliffs, for the freedom of her youth, for the girl who had sat on a rock and tried to capture the soul of the sea. She saw a change in Thomas too. He grew more withdrawn, his silences longer, his eyes holding a sadness she couldn't quite reach. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, his gaze lost in the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, out on the dark, lonely expanse of the sea. The roses he gave her on their anniversary, once a symbol of their passionate, enduring love, now felt more like a habit, a gesture performed out of a sense of duty rather than a heartfelt expression of his love. One evening, as she was putting the children to bed, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She saw a woman with tired eyes and a hint of sadness around her mouth, a woman she barely recognized. We have everything we ever dreamed of, she thought, a wave of sadness washing over her. So why does it feel like we're standing on opposite shores? Thomas, out on the cold, unforgiving sea, felt the distance too. He was a man of few words, a man who had always found it easier to express his love through actions rather than words. But now even his actions felt hollow, his gestures empty. He was a man adrift, lost in a sea of his own making. How do I tell her, he thought, as he stood on the deck of the fishing boat, the salt spray cold on his face, that the sea is not the only thing that pulls me away, that I am lost, and I am afraid of taking her down with me. The 1970s arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. The world was changing, and so were they. The children were older, their lives a whirlwind of school and friends and their own burgeoning dreams, leaving a quiet, echoing space in the cottage that had once been filled with their laughter. The seaside town, once a place of hopeful beginnings, now felt smaller, more claustrophobic, its familiar routines a constant reminder of the life they had built together, a life that was now beginning to feel like a cage. The ever-present sea, once a symbol of their shared love, was now a symbol of the vast, cold distance between them. It was a constant mocking reminder of the chasm that had opened up between them, a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. The discovery came on a bleak, wind-swept afternoon in late autumn. Helen was tidying Thomas's study, a small, cluttered room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, when she found it. A letter, tucked away in the back of a drawer, its pages thin and brittle with age. It was a confession, a brief, regrettable affair Thomas had had while away at sea, a moment of weakness, of loneliness, of a desperate, misguided attempt to find a harbour in a storm. The words on the page were a blur, the ink a trail of black against the pale, fragile paper, but the meaning was clear. The betrayal was a quiet, devastating blow, a wound that went deeper than any she had ever known. It was not a grand, dramatic revelation, but a slow, creeping poison that seeped into her heart, chilling her to the bone. She confronted him that evening. He came home, weary from the sea, his face etched with the lines of a hard day's work, and found her sitting in the living room, the letter on the table in front of her. She did not rage, did not scream, did not throw accusations at him like stones. She simply looked at him, her sea-green eyes filled with a profound, aching sorrow, a sorrow that was more devastating than any anger. The house, once filled with the warmth of their love, was now soiled and cold. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of 1,000 shared memories, now tainted by the bitter taste of betrayal. "You gave me a rose for passion," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "But you gave that to someone else. What is left for me?" Thomas stood before her, a man stripped bare, his defences gone, his soul laid open for her to see. He had no words, no excuses, no explanations that could bridge the chasm that now separated them. "I have shattered the one perfect thing I ever built," he thought, a wave of despair washing over him, "and I don't know how to piece it back together." For the sake of the children, they continued to live together, two ghosts haunting the rooms of their shared life. They spoke in polite, clipped sentences, their conversations a carefully constructed dance of avoidance, their words as empty and as hollow as the space between them. The intimacy was gone, replaced by a cold, unforgiving silence. On their anniversary that year, Thomas left the roses on the kitchen table. A single red rose, a single white rose, a solemn, desperate plea for forgiveness. But Helen didn't acknowledge them. She walked past them, her face a mask of indifference, her heart a frozen, desolate landscape. The roses, once a symbol of their enduring love, now stood as a testament to their shattered dreams, their wilting petals a reflection of the love that was slowly, inexorably dying. The storm that had been brewing in their hearts for years finally broke on a wild, tempestuous night in the late 70s. A violent storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the waves crashing against the cliffs with a furious, relentless roar. The sea, that old familiar friend, had become a raging, malevolent beast. Its fury a mirror of the storm that was about to break within the four walls of their cottage. The storm had trapped them together, the forced proximity a pressure cooker of unspoken emotions. The silence that had been their constant companion for so long was now a palpable, suffocating presence, a tension that was as thick and as charged as the air before a lightning strike. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. He looked at Helen, her face pale and drawn in the flickering candlelight, her eyes fixed on the storm-tossed sea outside the window, and he could bear it no longer. He broke down, the tears he had held back for so long finally streaming down his face, his body racked with sobs. He confessed everything, not just the infidelity, but the loneliness and fear that had driven him to it. He told her of the long, empty nights at sea, the feeling of being adrift, of being lost in a world that seemed to have no anchor. He didn't make excuses, didn't try to justify his actions. He simply offered her the raw, unvarnished truth of his heart, a heart that was broken and bruised and filled with a regret so profound it threatened to consume him. Helen listened, her own heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She saw not a monster, but a man she had loved, a man who was as lost and as afraid as she was. And in his confession, in his raw, unbridled vulnerability, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own fear of losing him completely. In their shared vulnerability, a fragile bridge was built across the chasm that separated them. They talked for hours, their voices raw with emotion, their words a torrent of long-held secrets and unspoken fears. They talked of their dreams and their disappointments, their hopes and their fears, their love and their loss. After the storm of their confessions had passed, a profound quiet descended upon the cottage. The wind still howled outside, the waves still crashed against the shore, but within the four walls of their home, a fragile peace had settled. He reached for her, his touch tentative, a question in his eyes. She leaned into him, a silent yes, a gesture of forgiveness, of acceptance of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. He kissed her, a kiss that was not of fiery passion, but of deep, soul-bearing tenderness. It was a kiss of forgiveness and remembrance, of a love that had weathered the storm and had emerged, battered, but not broken on the other side. His hands traced the lines of her face, the curve of her back, as if relearning her after a long absence. He led her to their bedroom, the room that had been a cold, silent tomb for so long, and in the flickering candlelight he undressed her, his touch reverent, his gaze full of a love that was deeper and more profound than any she had ever known. He laid her down on the bed, her body a pale, beautiful landscape in the soft yellow light, and he worshipped her with his hands, with his mouth, with his body. When their bodies finally came together, it was a slow, sacred reunion, a quiet, desperate affirmation of the love that had weathered the storm. It was a dance of forgiveness and remembrance, a silent promise to never let go again. It was a love that was not perfect but was real, a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity and had emerged, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The years that followed the storm were years of quiet, steady renewal. The love that had been rekindled in the crucible of their shared vulnerability did not burn with the fiery, impetuous passion of their youth, but with a slow, steady flame, a warmth that permeated every corner of their lives. It was a love that was deeper, richer, more profound than anything they had ever known, a love that had been forged in the fires of forgiveness and had been tempered by the harsh realities of life. The annual rose tradition was reinstated, no longer a habit, but a cherished ritual. Every year, on the anniversary of their first kiss, Thomas would bring Helen a red rose and a white rose, a symbol of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. The roses were a testament to their resilience, a reminder of the storm they had weathered together, and a promise of the calm, peaceful harbour they had found in each other's arms. They grew old together, their lives a gentle, comforting rhythm of shared memories and quiet contentment. The cottage, once a place of defiant, aching loneliness, was now a haven of peace and tranquillity, filled with the scent of old books and dried flowers, and the warmth of a love that had stood the test of time. The winter of their lives arrived, not with a sudden frost, but as a slow, quiet chill. With it, Helen's health began to fail. The sea-green eyes that had once held the fire of a wild, untamed spirit now held a quiet, gentle wisdom. The hands that had once sketched the wild beauty of the cliffs were now frail and trembling, but they were never far from Thomas's, their fingers intertwined in a silent, unspoken language of love. On their last anniversary together, Thomas brought the roses to her bedside. She was frail, her breath a shallow whisper, but her eyes were clear and bright, and they lit up when she saw him. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, his touch as gentle as a summer breeze. "One for passion," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears as he placed the red rose in her hand, "and one for the love that holds it." He placed the white rose next to it, its petals a stark, beautiful contrast to the crimson of the red rose. She smiled, a faint, beautiful smile that transformed her face, and he leaned in and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that was full of a lifetime of love. It was a kiss of farewell, but also of infinite tenderness, a kiss that spoke of a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death. They held each other, their breathing in sync, a final peaceful union of two souls who had become one. Years after Helen's passing, a young woman, her heart shattered by a recent breakup, visited the seaside town. She was drawn to the cliffs, to the raw wild beauty of the sea, and she saw an old man, his face a roadmap of a life well lived, standing at the edge of the cliff, a red rose and a white rose in his hand. He placed the roses on the edge of the cliff, a silent, solitary tribute to a love that had not ended, even in death. He saw the young woman, her face etched with the sorrow he knew all too well, and he smiled a gentle, understanding smile. He told her their story, the story of a love that was not perfect but was real, a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. He told her of the roses, of the storm, of the quiet, enduring love that had been the anchor of his life. The young woman left the seaside town not with answers but with a renewed sense of hope. She had learned that love, in its purest form, is not a fairy tale, but a garden that must be tended, weeded, and cherished through all seasons. And she had learned that the greatest loves are not those without storms, but those that learn to dance in the rain and continue to bloom, year after year, long after the sun has set. In the way she moves. The late autumn air of London, 1970, was a thing of perpetual melancholy. It clung to the bricks of Notting Hill, a cool, damp shroud smelling of coal smoke, turpentine, and the city's unceasing patience. From his cramped top-floor studio, Trenton watched it all through a haze of rain-streaked glass. The world below was a blur of hurried umbrellas, muted greys and browns, a monochrome symphony of transit and indifference. For months this had been his view, and it was a perfect reflection of the landscape within him. His studio, once a sanctuary of creative fire, was now a mausoleum of half-forgotten ambition. Canvases, their faces turned to the wall like ashamed ghosts, stood in silent judgment. He, Trenton, a painter of once celebrated talent, now found himself a stranger to his own art, a man adrift in a sea of grey canvas. He felt a hollowness that no amount of linseed oil or city noise could fill, a creative apathy that was as familiar and insidious as the relentless London rain. He stood by the window, a cup of cold tea forgotten in his hand, a brush as heavy as a lead weight at his side. He had spent the morning trying to capture the shifting light, but all he'd managed was a muddy, lifeless smear. The canvas mocked him. It was a blank slate, a mirror showing him nothing but his own creative emptiness. He had lost the ability to feel, to see, to translate the chaos of life into the ordered beauty of paint. He was an observer, detached and listless, watching the world move on without him. The patter of rain against the glass was the only sound that seemed to reach him, a monotonous drumbeat marking the passage of his uninspired days. And then she appeared. Below, in the archway of a defunct shopfront on Portobello Road, a woman stood alone. She had no umbrella, no hurried gait. Her face was turned up to the sky, letting the fine mist kiss her skin. For a moment, she was a statue, a singular point of stillness in the city's kinetic sprawl. And then she began to move. It was not a performance. There was no stage, no audience, save for the rain and the artist watching from the window above. Her arms swept up in a fluid, instinctive arc, as if she were embracing the very sky. Her body swayed, a slow, deliberate waltz with the elements, a silent conversation between her soul and the falling drops. She moved with a grace that seemed to generate its own private music, a melody of muscle and bone, of longing and release. Her movements were not a dance in the traditional sense, but a pure, unself-conscious expression of something deeply held within. She was utterly herself, utterly alone and utterly breathtaking. Trenton was transfixed. The teacup clattered from his hand, the ceramic shattering on the floor. But he did not hear it. It was as if a jolt of lightning, a fierce white-hot current, had shot through his dormant veins. For months there has been nothing, he thought, his mind racing. A grey canvas, a grey city. And then there was her. She wasn't dancing for an audience, she was dancing because the rain demanded it. She was the colour, the thought was a revelation. It was the first true, raw feeling he had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. With a desperate, scrambling fervour he hadn't felt in years, he grabbed his charcoal and sketchbook. His hands were unsteady, trembling with a newfound urgency. He didn't try to capture her face, it was a fleeting vision, an impossibility. Instead, he focused on the lines of her body, the delicate curve of her neck, the eloquent slope of her back as she bent to the rhythm of the rain. He worked with a feverish intensity, the charcoal a furious extension of his own reawakened spirit. He muttered to himself, his voice a low, gravelly whisper in the sudden silence of his studio. "Don't look away. Stay still. No, don't stay still, just be." The charcoal scratched and scraped against the rough paper, a stark black line trying to capture the impossible fluidity of a soul in motion. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her to that damp archway, but in her unburdened movement, he had found his muse. He had found his voice, and in a small, forgotten corner of his heart, he found the first stirrings of something far deeper than mere inspiration. He had found a reason to feel again. The world of Portobello Market on a Saturday was a sensory assault, a riotous canvas of colour, sound, and 1,000 overlapping lives. It was the antithesis of Trenton's quiet, melancholic studio, and it was here that he spent his days, no longer in listless observation, but in obsessive pursuit. He was a man consumed, his every waking moment centred on the memory of the girl in the rain. The charcoal sketches from that day were now pinned to his easel, the furious lines a constant silent reminder of the creative rebirth she had triggered. He had started a series of paintings, bold and vibrant, infused with a life he thought he had lost forever. The grey of his world was gone, replaced by a symphony of blues, greens and ochres, all inspired by the ghostly lines of her form. His work was transformed, infused with a breathless, kinetic energy. He haunted Portobello Road, a quiet spectre amidst the boisterous crowds, hoping for another glimpse. He saw countless faces, heard countless voices, but none of them held the silent eloquence of the woman he had drawn. His heart would quicken at the sight of a certain silhouette, only to fall back into a familiar rhythm of disappointment. He was beginning to wonder if she had been a dream, a beautiful hallucination born of his desperate need for inspiration. Then he saw her. She was standing at a stall selling old vinyl records, her back to him. She wasn't dancing, but her hands moved with the same familiar grace, her long, slender fingers tracing the grooves on a record sleeve, a silent, intimate exploration. His heart, which had been a drumbeat of anticipation for weeks, now hammered against his ribs with a sudden, overwhelming force. He felt a nervous heat flush through him, a feeling he had forgotten in his years of reclusion. He approached, his steps careful, hesitant. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, unsure of what to say to the living, breathing source of his newfound passion. He finally settled on a phrase so utterly mundane it felt like a betrayal of his own emotional turmoil. "It's a good day for the market," he said, his voice a little hoarse. She didn't turn. He waited, a flush of embarrassment rising on his neck. Had she not heard him? He reached out, gently touching her arm, his fingers barely grazing the soft wool of her coat. She startled, turning quickly, her eyes wide with surprise. They were large, a deep liquid brown and startlingly perceptive, a universe of silent thought within them. A small apologetic smile touched her lips, and she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a little notepad and a pen. She scribbled something quickly, her handwriting neat and elegant, and held it out to him. "I'm sorry, I am deaf." Trenton was stunned. The revelation was not a barrier, but a kind of anointment. He understood now the profound, wordless beauty of her dance in the rain, the unself-conscious grace of her hands. The music stopped, she had written, but the dance did not. He took the notepad from her, his own fingers trembling slightly. He didn't ask about her deafness. Instead, he wrote, his penmanship clumsy and raw with emotion. "I'm a painter. I saw you, last week, in the rain." He then took his sketchbook from his bag, flipping through the pages until he found the charcoal drawings he'd made that day. He held the book open for her, her breath caught in a soft, audible gasp. She looked from the frantic, soulful lines on the page to his face, her expression a mix of shock and wonder, and then a genuine, unguarded smile. A thing of pure, unadulterated light blossomed on her face. In that single breathtaking moment, there was a profound, wordless understanding between them. He saw that she knew he hadn't seen her as a curiosity or a subject of pity, but as a source of transcendent beauty. He saw the recognition in her eyes. He had seen her, not her silence, not what she had lost. He had seen her movement. He had seen her. For the next hour they talked via the notepad, a shared sacred space of ink and paper. He learned her name was Kaylee. She learned his was Trenton. He learned she had been a ballerina, her career tragically cut short. She wrote with a kind of quiet strength. The music stopped, but the dance did not. He wrote back, his heart aching with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. "You don't need music. You are the music." He told her he had a studio just above them, a haven of light and colour that had been reborn because of her. With a mixture of shyness and hope, he invited her to see the paintings he had started. Her hesitation was visible, a flicker of fear in her expressive eyes, but she nodded. The notepad was passed back and forth, a bridge between two worlds, and in their hands the scent of old paper and ink was a perfume of new beginnings. The studio, once Trenton's lonely bastion, became their shared haven. The low autumn sun, when it broke through the perpetual London cloud, would fill the room with a warm, dusty gold, illuminating the canvases that now pulsed with Kaylee's silent energy. These sessions were their courtship, a slow, tender dance of creation and connection. Kaylee never posed, she simply existed. She would move, her body recalling the ghost of 1,000 practiced movements. She'd show him her ballet exercises, the graceful pliés, the elegant extensions, the small private gestures of her art. He would sit, his brush a silent, furious extension of his will, translating her soul onto canvas. Silence was not an absence between them, it was their shared language, a sacred medium more potent than any spoken word. He watched her hands, her back, the curve of her neck, the same lines he had furiously sketched in the rain, and he painted not what he saw, but what he felt. Her joy, her sorrow, her quiet resilience, it all found its way onto his canvases. The collection grew, a testament to a love born of observation and movement. The centerpiece was a large, unfinished work, a portrait of Kaylee with her face upturned to the sky, a quiet power in her eyes. It was a masterpiece, a culmination of his rediscovered talent and his burgeoning love. The intrusion came in the form of Julian, Trenton's agent. A sharp, polished man, Julian saw not art but commerce. He arrived unannounced one afternoon, his eyes sweeping over the vibrant canvases with a predatory gleam. He was floored, a word he rarely used. "My God, Trenton," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. This is a comeback. The best work you've ever done." His gaze landed on the centerpiece. "And the muse, the deaf dancer of Portobello. It's poetic. We'll build a whole exhibition around it. The narrative is gold, Trenton, pure gold. Trenton, a man long starved of validation, was swept up in the whirlwind of Julian's enthusiasm. He saw the gallery lights, the critical acclaim, the return to a world he had thought was lost to him forever. He initially agreed, his head buzzing with the promise of success. When he told Kaylee later, her face, a canvas of emotion in itself, was a story of hope and fear. She was happy for him, her eyes bright with pride. But her joy was immediately overshadowed by a deep, visceral fear. The idea of her private reclamation being turned into a public spectacle, a story of pity and tragedy for a hungry audience, was terrifying. It threatened to cage the very freedom he'd fallen in love with. But they will see your strength, your beauty, he argued, his written notes filled with a kind of desperate logic he didn't understand. She took the notepad, her handwriting tight with emotion, the words a jagged line of hurt. They will put me in a box. The world you want to show me to is the one I had to leave. This place, this silence, is ours. Don't give it away. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt misunderstood, a sudden cold distance growing between them. Was it her I saw, or just a beautiful story I could paint? He stared at the half-finished canvas, the centerpiece of Julian's dream. It stared back at him, an accusing eye. He felt a sudden, deafening emptiness in the studio, a silence that was no longer a shared sanctuary, but a heavy, impenetrable barrier. Kaylee looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that spoke of a betrayal more profound than any spoken word. She had given him the raw, vulnerable truth of her soul, and he had, in her eyes, tried to sell it. The notepad lay closed on the table between them, a dead thing, no longer a bridge but a wall. Kaylee disappeared. She didn't answer the notes he left at her flat, a silence that was more damning than any angry word could have been. Trenton was left alone with his paintings, a beautiful, vibrant collection that now felt like a gallery of beautiful lies. He stood before the half-finished canvas, the one that Julian had coveted, the one he had so foolishly, so blithely agreed to show. He stared at her painted form, her face upturned in a moment of pure, unguarded joy, and he finally truly understood. The art was meaningless without the soul it was meant to honour. He had not seen her. He had seen an idea of her, a beautiful, tragic narrative he could exploit. The thought was a sickening punch to his gut. He realised that the greatest beauty in the room was not the canvases on the wall, but Kaylee herself. The connection, the shared silence, the unspoken understanding, that was the masterpiece. He called Julian and with a quiet, certain finality cancelled the exhibition. He knew he had to find her. He searched the haunts they had shared, the small cafes and bookshops, the winding, chaotic alleys of Portobello Road. She wasn't there. Then a memory surfaced. The old dusty community dance hall she had mentioned once. The kind with worn floorboards and the ghost of 1,000 waltzes in the air. He found her there in the quiet, consecrated space, a solitary figure in the centre of the room. She was dancing, but the joy was gone. Her movements were sharp, pained. An argument with herself, her body a vessel of her heartbreak. The dance was no longer a celebration, but a plea, a silent cry of loss. He didn't interrupt. He waited, standing in the shadows, until the last exhausted movement ceased, and she stood breathing hard, her shoulders heaving in the centre of the room. She caught his reflection in the peeling mirror and froze. He didn't try to explain with more words. Words had failed them. Instead, he took a single piece of paper from his pocket, a fresh, clean page from the notepad that had once been their bridge. He held it up. The words were simple, a single, humble truth. There is no show, there is only you. He walked toward her, closing the distance between them, and didn't speak. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, and placed it flat against his chest. She could feel the frantic, unsteady rhythm of his heart, a confession of his turmoil, his shame, his love. He lifted his other hand to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with the reverence of an artist and the tenderness of a lover, his touch a silent prayer for forgiveness. He leaned in and kissed her, and the kiss was everything at once, an apology, a promise and a prayer. It was a slow, deepening exploration, an unhurried claiming. When he drew her close, their bodies pressing together, it was fire and fragility, a silent conversation where every touch said, "I see you, only you." It wasn't about passion as a conquest, but passion as recognition, a profound acknowledgement of her being. He kissed her as if he was breathing her in, relearning and her language through touch alone. His hand slid lower, tracing the curve of her back, and she moaned softly against his lips. The kiss deepened, a tide of mutual need and longing. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her impossibly closer, their bodies fitting together with a heat that made her knees weaken. The studio was no longer just his workspace, it had been transformed, reborn. It was no longer a room of solitude, but a world built for two. The tone was one of quiet, profound joy, a peace that had settled deep within the bones of the old room. A week after the reckoning in the dance hall, he led Kaylee into the space. He had arranged all the paintings, lit them perfectly, a small private gallery for an audience of one. She walked slowly, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of her own silent story. The final painting, the centerpiece, was finished. In it, she was not just an anonymous figure of grace, she was Kaylee, looking directly at the viewer, a quiet, knowing power in her eyes, a woman who had found her voice again. The tension that had once clung to the room like a shroud was gone, replaced by a soft, settled intimacy. They were no longer just artist and muse, but partners in creation. He showed her how to mix pigments, the vibrant powders swirling into rich living colour. Her fingers, which had once told stories in movement, now guided his hand on a blank canvas. Her fingers over his, showing him the flow of her movement, a new, shared language of colour and form. The studio, which had once felt so empty, was now filled with the silent music of their collaboration. That night, surrounded by the testament of his love for her, they came together for the first time. It was not a desperate reconciliation, but a joyful celebration, a dance of two people who had finally found their rhythm, their place in the world. He kissed her first, a slow, unhurried brush of lips that was more question than statement. Her response was a soft gasp, an invitation. Their kisses deepened, a silent, searching conversation that spoke of all the longing they had held back. His hands, the same hands that had translated her soul onto canvas, now moved to the buttons of her dress, clumsy with the reverence and need. She met his gaze, her eyes dark and full of a trusting vulnerability, and her own hands moved to the buttons of his shirt. Clothes fell away, a gentle rustle of fabric in the quiet room. He ran his hands over the planes of her body, marvelling at the soft heat of her skin, and she did the same, her touch a discovery of his strength and vulnerability. They moved as one, a seamless, silent choreography, until they found themselves pressed against the cold glass of the window, their naked bodies a warm, living contrast to the rain-slicked pane. He then turned her back to him, her body a perfect, continuous line of surrender against the chilly window. He took her hands and with a tender possessiveness brought them above her head, pressing her full length against the cold glass. Her breath came in short, desperate bursts, a silent cadence of both anticipation and vulnerability. He moved close, his breath hot against the back of her neck, his lips worshipping the lines and curves of her back, the landscape he had first sketched in the rain. She shivered, a low, guttural moan escaping her throat as his touch, his breath, his mouth, traced the path he had once only captured in charcoal, igniting a new, desperate fire on her skin. He lingered there, a reverent artist at work, his hands moving lower to cup her hips and pull her flush against him, their bodies a new, perfect language. The world dissolved into a blur of touch and feeling. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, their love-making a tender, certain, and beautiful act of creation. The city lights below cast a soft, golden glow on their faces, illuminating their shared breath, her trembling sighs, and a feeling of absolute belonging. He held her, his body a silent anchor to her dance, and in the whisper of skin on skin, in the feel of her heart thudding against his, he knew a truth deeper than any he could paint. He didn't want to leave her now. He knew he believed, and how. In her arms, he was no longer a man adrift, but a man at anchor. Kaylee, too, had found her purpose, a new dance born of their shared silence. She rented the old dusty dance hall twice a week and started a small free class. Not for ballerinas, but for deaf children, teaching them to communicate not just through signs, but through the joyous, uninhibited freedom of movement. Trenton was always there, a quiet, constant presence in the corner, sketching the joyous, silent chaos. He was no longer a reclusive observer, but a quiet guardian of their world, a man who had not only found his art, but had found a love that made the art worth creating. He had spent his life trying to capture truth on canvas, only to find it was not something to be captured at all, but something to be felt in the silent, perfect rhythm of a world built for two. The sound of children's silent laughter, expressed through stomping feet and waving arms, was all the music they needed. Lifeboat number 6. The great ship groaned. It was a sound that went beyond the ears, a low, metallic agony that vibrated in the very marrow of Marguerite Maggie Devereux. Only moments ago she had been a whirlwind of silken laughter, a bright bird preening for the grand dining room of the RMS Titanic. Now her velvet cloak was ripped, her hair escaping its meticulously pinned chignon in a wild halo of mahogany curls. She was a woman reduced to her most fundamental form, a terrified, desperate animal clinging to a rapidly vanishing life. Maggie, the darling of Denver society, a creature whose every moment was defined by the security of wealth and the bravado of youth, felt her meticulously constructed world splintering into a million icy shards. Just breathe. Just stay on your feet. Don't let them see you're afraid. A Devereux is never afraid. She chanted the mantra to herself, a hollow echo of her father's proud words. But the fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her gut, and it choked her with the acrid scent of salt water and coal smoke. The deck beneath her feet tilted at an impossible angle, a grotesque funhouse floor. The roar of escaping steam from the great funnels was a primeval scream, a sound of such titanic fury, it felt as though the very heavens were being torn apart. Amid the din, the splintering crack of wood and the desperate human cries created a symphony of terror. Above it all, the glittering, mocking lights of the ship hung like a celestial necklace against a black, star-dusted sky, seemed to be plunging head-first into a velvet abyss. Maggie, jostled by a panicked crowd, was pressed inexorably towards a lifeboat. Her innate confidence, a carefully cultivated shell of brash wit and easy charm, was cracking. She had never been a small woman, but here she felt as insignificant as a doll. A Devereux never pushed, never scrambled. They glided, they commanded, but in this moment, Maggie was merely cargo being swept along in a human tide. She stumbled, regaining her footing, her hand clutching desperately at the railing as the deck lurched again. She saw it then, the stark black silhouette of Lifeboat No. 6 swinging low and menacing over the freezing North Atlantic. The sight of the boat was an anchor, a promise of survival, and a fresh wave of adrenaline pulsed through her, wiping away the last vestiges of her cultured facade. A few yards away, a man stood apart from the pandemonium. He was tall and lean in the uniform of a British naval officer, though Maggie knew from the pre-sailing passenger list that he was travelling as a civilian. William Kent was his name. He was a man of quiet angles and sharp edges, his jaw set in a line of stoic resolve. He was directing the loading of the lifeboat with a chilling, detached calm, his training kicking in as surely as an instinct. His hands, gloved in white, moved with a steady, unhurried purpose, helping a frantic mother and her child into the boat, his voice a low, calming presence in the roiling darkness. "Steady on," he said to a man whose terror had made him clumsy. "One foot in front of the other. That's it." He was a man of duty, a man of order, even as his world too was collapsing. His face was a mask of concentration, his gaze fixed on the task, but Maggie saw the slight tremor in his jaw, the flicker of steel in his eyes, and knew that beneath the calm lay a coiled and terrible tension. There was no melodrama in him, no grand pronouncements, just a quiet, unflinching resolve. And then, everything happened at once. A fresh lurch of the ship, more violent than any before, ripped Maggie's hand from the railing. She stumbled, cried out, and was caught in the crush of a wave of people desperately trying to reach the lifeboat. She was airborne for a single breathless moment, and then she fell tumbling head over heels into the boat. She landed in a heap, her cheeks scraped, her ribs aching, but she was in. She was safe. She lay there, dazed, gasping for air, clutching at the rough wooden planks beneath her. She felt the heavy weight of a man's body settle against her, his firm hands holding her in place. She looked up, and her eyes, still wide with terror, met his. It was William Kent. He was looking at her, not with pity, but with a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. His eyes were the colour of the dark, freezing sea, fathomless and grave, and for a fleeting eternal moment time stopped. The roar of the steam, the splintering of the wood, the cries of the dying, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the low groan of the ship, and the two of them held in that instant of shared, raw humanity. Maggie Devereux, the socialite who had never known a moment of genuine fear, and William Kent, the naval officer who had trained for every possible outcome, were together, cast adrift in a world of ice and death, united by the most improbable of sparks. The cries from the sinking ship had at last faded into the deep silence of the North Atlantic. The rhythmic splash of oars and the chattering of teeth were the only sounds now, a counterpoint to the terrifying calm that had replaced the roar of the disaster. Maggie, no longer just a spectator, had found an oar. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labour, ached with a dull, throbbing pain, but a fierce, almost defiant determination had taken root in her. She had shed the last of her velvet cloak in the lifeboat, and with it, the last pretence of her former life. Now she rowed. Her movements were clumsy at first, a raw, uncoordinated effort born of a desperate need to survive. She watched the man across from her, his movements economical and strong, and tried to mimic him. "You're using too much of your arms," William said, his voice a low, calm rumble into the darkness. "Let your back do the work. Lean into it. That's it. Conserve your strength." He spoke with the quiet authority of a commander, but there was no arrogance in it, only a simple, undeniable truth. He was a man accustomed to leading, and in this small world of the lifeboat, crammed full with frightened souls, he was the centre of a fragile new order. Maggie, stripped of her own authority, found herself yielding to his. She adjusted her rhythm, feeling her back muscles tense and flex, and soon fell into a steady, almost meditative rhythm. The shared work, the unspoken trust between them, began to forge a new kind of intimacy, one born not of flirtation or wit, but of sheer, undeniable need. As the night wore on, A new silence, one of shared vulnerability and quiet fear, settled over the lifeboat. The cold seeped into their bones, but the rhythm of their conversation began to generate a different kind of warmth. Maggie, whose life had been a series of witty quips and charming anecdotes, found herself talking about things that mattered. She spoke of her boisterous, loving family in Denver, her father's larger-than-life personality, and her own wild, untamed spirit. A spirit that had chafed against the confines of polite society. She spoke of her love for riding through the wide-open spaces of the American West, of the sheer, unadulterated freedom of it. William in turn spoke of his own life, a quieter, more regimented one. He was a man of duty, of honour, a man who believed in order and consequence. He spoke of his time as a naval cadet, of the rigid discipline that had shaped him, of the unspoken code of honour that governed his world. He spoke too of a lost love, a quiet English girl he had courted for years, a girl who had died of a fever while he was at sea. The story was told without drama, but in its stark simplicity Maggie heard a history of deep, enduring grief. He had loved her, he said, because she represented all that was steady and good in the world, the quiet anchor that he believed a man needed. When he had finished, he fell silent, staring up at the indifferent, star-filled canopy above them. In that moment, Maggie saw the emotional armour he wore, the wall he had built around his heart to protect it from the chaos of life. She, who had once prided herself on her fearlessness, recognised in him a far deeper and more terrifying courage. The courage to stand alone in the face of an insurmountable loss. They rowed on side by side, their hands raw, their bodies cold, but their souls finding a strange, unexpected closeness. The creak of the oarlocks, the taste of salt on their lips, the shared warmth of a threadbare blanket, these were the anchors of their new reality. Maggie, with a boldness born of the moment, reached out and touched his hand on the oar. He did not pull away. His gaze, once so detached, was now turned to her, and in its fathomless depths she saw a flicker of something new, a nascent understanding, a fragile thread of connection that had somehow survived the sinking of the world. She had never been so vulnerable, and yet in this small, crowded boat in the middle of a vast and frozen ocean, she had never felt so seen. The decks of the rescue ship, the Carpathia, were a new world, a stark contrast to the small, intimate cosmos of Lifeboat No. 6. The chaotic calm of survival had given way to a dawning, terrible reality. The air, once filled with the rhythmic creak of oars and the hushed tones of shared secrets, now held the pervasive scent of hot coffee and the low, mournful murmur of the grieving. It was here, in the relative safety of a new and ordered world, that the chasm between Maggie Devereux and William Kent began to appear. Maggie, her brash confidence returning in the warmth of the ship, was a magnet for the other survivors. She moved among them with a renewed vivacity, her natural charisma drawing out stories, offering comfort, and becoming in her way a small centre of light in the ship's sombre atmosphere. She found herself surrounded by people who spoke her language, whose world she understood instinctively. They were alive, and that was all that mattered. "We're alive," she said to a woman from her deck, a fellow American socialite whose glittering dress she had once envied. "That's all that matters now." She wore a borrowed dress, simple and practical, and her hair was still a wild, untamed mess. But her spirit was once again buoyant, her wit a bright, flashing thing. The chaos had stripped her, but it had not broken her. She was a creature of the sunlight, a woman who needed the noise and bustle of the world to be herself. Her energy, born of her fierce will to live, was contagious, and others clung to it, finding in her a momentary respite from their own grief. William, in contrast, was a man retreating. He stood apart, maintaining a stoic reserve that was a world away from the intimacy of the lifeboat. He was a quiet, internal man, a man of duty. and the public spectacle of the survivors was alien to him. He was a creature of the shadows, of quiet order, and in the bright, chaotic light of the Carpathia, he felt himself withdrawing. He saw Maggie in her element, her eyes bright with a kind of feverish joy, and felt the return of his own emotional reserve, a cold, protective shell he had long cultivated. The bond forged in the lifeboat, an unspoken understanding born of shared fear and struggle, felt thin and fragile, a thing of the night that might not survive the light of day. They found a brief stolen moment together on the crowded deck, the wind whipping at their clothes, the wail of the ship's foghorn a lonely sound in the mist. Maggie, reaching out to him, found him distant, his gaze fixed on the endless grey of the sea. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low and hesitant, a far cry from the booming confidence of her public self. "I am fine," he said, and his voice was clipped, polite, a stranger's voice. He looked at her, his eyes cold and grave, and for a moment she felt a chill deeper than the ocean's touch. He saw in her a creature of light, of careless, boisterous life, and felt the return of his old wound, the fear of attachment, the pain of a love that had ended in death. "She is a creature of sunlight," his inner voice whispered, a refrain echoing in the classic literary style of his guarded heart. "I belong to the shadows." As they approached New York Harbor, the sight of the Statue of Liberty through the mist was a promise of a new life, a new world. To Maggie, it was a symbol of her own wild, untamed spirit, a fierce, glorious promise of a future she would shape herself. To William, it was a beacon of a world he did not understand, a world of chaos and sentiment that he had long been trained to fear. They stood together on the deck side by side, but the ocean that had brought them together now felt like an impassable chasm. The unspoken connection, the fragile, beautiful thing they had found in the heart of the frozen sea, seemed to have shattered with the first light of day. The fire crackled in the hearth of Maggie's Denver parlour, its dancing light the only illumination in the room. Months had passed since the sinking, months during which Maggie had tried to bury the memories of that night, to lose herself in the bustling, confident rhythm of a new life, a life built on the foundations of old certainties. She was a woman of position, of privilege, but the memory of the lifeboat, of the quiet man with the fathomless eyes, remained a raw, unhealed wound in her soul. A knock came at the door, sharp and unexpected. Maggie, startled from her reverie, rose to answer it herself. Standing on her porch, framed by the cold twilight of a Colorado evening, was William Kent. He was out of uniform, his clothes those of a civilian, but the stoic resolve of the naval officer was etched in every line of his body. He was determined, his usual reserve stripped away by a terrible fear, the fear of a love that had been forged in a crucible of ice and was now threatened by the light of day. "William," she said, her voice a ghost of its former self, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Maggie," he said, and the word was a plea, a confession, a prayer. He came in, leaving the door open to the cold, and they stood in the silent parlour, the firelight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The intimacy of the lifeboat, of shared suffering and hushed confessions, rushed back, a powerful, palpable force in the quiet room. They talked for hours, long into the night. They spoke of the unspoken, of the fragile, terrified bond they had formed in the open sea. They acknowledged the depth of the connection, the raw, undeniable attraction that had transcended the icy horror surrounding them. He told her of his months of restless nights, of trying to forget a woman who was a creature of sunlight, and failing. She confessed her own struggle, her attempts to return to a life of cheerful ease, a life that now felt thin and false. He moved to her then, drawn by an irresistible force, his usual stoicism a distant memory. The fire crackled and spit, the only witness to their reckoning. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and traced the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver through her, a current of longing that left her breathless. He had kissed her once, on the deck of the Carpathia, a brief, desperate kiss of a world ending. This was different. This was a kiss of a world beginning. He leaned in, and his mouth, once a firm, guarded line, met hers. It was not a kiss of desperate urgency, but a slow, deliberate tenderness, a silent promise of a love that had been waiting, smouldering in the dark for months. His hands moved to her hair, his fingers tangling in the soft curls, freeing them from their pins and brushes, letting them fall in a wild cascade around her face. Her hands came up to cup his face, her thumbs stroking his cheeks, tracing the sharp, proud line of his bone structure. The kiss deepened, becoming more insistent, a wordless conversation of need and desire. His mouth became a demand, a reverent exploration of her. He kissed her like a man possessed by a beautiful and terrible hunger. Clothes were shed with a sense of ceremony, of unveiling something sacred. Skin met skin in a heated rush, a silent, breathless communion. He laid her back on the thick fur rug in front of the fire, his body a warm, solid weight against hers. His eyes, fixed on hers, held a silent question in their depths. She answered with a soft gasp, a slight arch of her back, a silent plea for more. His hand slid lower, exploring her with a mixture of reverence and hunger, his touch sending a tremor of pleasure through her. He moved within her slowly at first, his eyes never leaving hers, savouring the way her body arched and trembled beneath his touch, then faster as their shared need consumed them in waves of pleasure. He gave himself to her with a completeness she had never known, his body a language of shared trauma and shared survival, of a love that was forged in the heart of a frozen sea. She clung to him with a hiss of wonder that was almost awe, her body quivering, unconscious and alive, like plasm. They moved as one, a symphony of touch and taste and scent, their breaths coming in rhythmic counterpoint to the crackling fire. He pulled her into a slow, deliberate embrace, their eyes locked, and she answered with a soft gasp, a silent arch of her back, a plea for more. He moved within her, a slow rhythmic dance that built in intensity, until they were a single, breathless, shuddering communion. Their bodies spoke a language of their own, a language of a love that was born in the heart of a frozen sea and had bloomed into something eternal. He felt her frenzy, her wild, passionate activity, and responded in kind, a deep and powerful giving that spoke of a surrender to a love as vast and terrifying as the ocean that had brought them together. In this year's vulnerable intimacy, Maggie felt the last of her old self melt away, and a new woman, unafraid of her own desires, emerged in the firelight. After the breathless climax, he did not recede, but remained intertwined with her, his presence a warm, steady beat against her heart. She felt a profound, beautiful vulnerability, and tears of pure wonder streamed silently down her face. He held her close, his embrace a silent promise of forever, and in the quiet of the room she knew with every fibre of her being that she was not alone. Their love, born of desperation and forged in the heart of a frozen sea, was a thing of truth and magnificent beauty. The Denver sun, wild and untamed as the landscape it illuminated, streamed through the windows of Maggie and William's new home. It was a sprawling house filled with the warmth of loving chaos, and it was here, amidst the wild beauty of the American West, that their love found its footing. William, having resigned his commission, had made a new life for himself. The man who had once believed so fiercely in order and discipline had found a different kind of peace in the beautiful, boisterous world Maggie had introduced him to. His love for her was a grounding force, a quiet anchor in the untamed landscape of a life lived for passion, not duty. He was a man of the shadows, but with Maggie, he had stepped into the light. Maggie, in turn, had found a new sense of purpose. Her brash spirit, once a mask for a deep-seated vulnerability, was now tempered by a newfound emotional depth. She had discovered in herself a well of strength she never knew she possessed, and her love for William allowed her to be both strong and soft, both brash and tender. They were married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by Maggie's boisterous, loving family. The wedding was a testament to the life they had built together, a life of honest love and quiet courage, a life that had been born in a lifeboat and had bloomed in the open air of the West. Months later, they stood on the porch of their new home, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The scent of pine and sagebrush was thick on the air, and the feel of the rough-hewn wood of the porch railing beneath their hands was a physical reminder of the solid world they had built together. William wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, feeling the steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that was now his own. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Maggie leaned back against him, her head resting on his shoulder. The endless star-filled sky stretched out before them, a constant presence in their darkest moments, and a reminder of the vast, miraculous universe in which they had found each other. "I knew," she said, her voice soft and full of a quiet certainty. "From the moment you pulled me into that lifeboat, I knew." He turned her in his arms, his eyes searching hers, his gaze dark and tender, and full of a promise that made her heart ache. "I love you, Maggie Devereaux," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I," she said, her voice catching, "love you, William Kent." He kissed her then, a kiss that was both a promise and a prayer, a testament to a love that was not born of fear, but of a shared and desperate hope. In the heart of a frozen sea they had found a warmth that defied the cold, and in the light of a new day they had found a love that defied the odds, a love that was and is and always will be their lifeboat.